everyone, and welcome to a new video. Today's video is one that I filmed well over a month ago, almost 2 months ago at this point, all about making a brown Renaissance gown. Now this dress was originally just supposed to be something simple that I could get done in a couple of days as a bit of a breather between two more complicated projects. But as I progressed on it, it became progressively more complicated. I wanted to add a lot more details to the sleeves and more details and embellishments in general, and it kind of spiraled out of control and into a project that took more than 10 days to complete. But I'm still really happy with how it turned out, and I'm excited to share the process of making it with all of you. Now, if you're new to my channel, this video is a vlog, which means it just has little snippets of me talking about what I've been up to and what progress I've made on that project throughout the day. It isn't a detailed breakdown of each step. If that's what you're looking for, then I would direct you to the Making a Video playlist, which will be linked in the description box, but this is more for the casual viewer. With that disclaimer out of the way, I guess I'll talk a little bit about the design itself. It's based off of Crenach paintings in particular, but German Renaissance gowns from the early 16th century in general. And I found a really great blog post that compiled a whole bunch of dresses with German origins from this period, and it was really neat going through and seeing all of the similarities they shared and how unique they were to styles that were fashionable in other countries. I really zeroed in on these in terms of inspiration and managed to create something vaguely similar to them out of materials that I had in my stash. I didn't make this with the intention of it being super historically accurate, but I did want it to look relatively historically accurate in terms of the silhouette and more historically inspired in terms of the textiles and embellishments that I used. I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I hope you enjoy seeing how it comes together as well. So it's 2 o'clock and this is where I am right now. I'm not sure if I'm going to officially call this project started until a bit later today, because I'm just gearing up to take a lunch break. But this is the current state of it. So I got everything cut out from a medium weight canvas interlining. So this is sold by a tailoring company. I'm sure you can get it other places too. And it's just an apparel canvas that's meant to stiffen lighter weight materials, especially when you're making suits. But it works really well for historical garments as well. So I traced out my pattern onto this material and I marked out all the boning channel placement, and then I cut the pieces out. And unlike in previous videos, I actually cut the pieces out properly, following all of the traced lines as opposed to leaving a margin around the traced lines, just because the process of assembly for this is a bit different. But anyway, I got the stomacher or the center portion cut out, and then I also got the 2 body pieces cut out. And now I've just sewn all of the boning channels into these. Didn't take me very long. I was having some tension issues, so it isn't the prettiest stitching, but it'll do just fine. It'll be hidden by the lining later on anyway. So this is all of the boning channel sewn. Now I'm going to cut out the top layer of fabric and baste the edges together, and then I'm going to add the boning. And these are the fabrics in question. I'm using this really pretty fabric with metallic threads in it and a brown base. It feels almost like a polyester file. And then this is a polyester brocade that I'll be using for contrast. So this will create a band around the neckline of the bodice, but I'm going to be cutting out that later after I've done a fitting with the bodice with just this layer of material covering it. So I'll keep you posted as I go. So this is the current state of the front panel. There's another one hanging around somewhere, but you really just need to see one. So I went ahead and basted the top layer of fabric onto the base layer that I cut out and added boning channels to. And then I just turned the front edge inward by 1/2 inch and top stitched it down. And then I top stitched some of this silvery trim along that edge. And this raw edge is going to be hidden by the collar piece, which I also got cut out and backed with interfacing to make it a little bit more structurally solid. And I really hope this ends up fitting in the shoulder, because if it doesn't, there's no seam there to fix it with. Let's just all hope for the best. But anyway, these were cut out and then I fused the interfacing onto the back of them. And then I went ahead and sewed trim onto one edge, and I also sewed 1/2 inch away from the front edge and then used that stitching as a guide for ironing that edge inward. So now this folded edge can be aligned with the edge of the bodice and slip stitched on. But before doing that, I think I'm actually going to seam the back piece together. So I'm going to take this back edge, the straight edge here, align that with the straight edge here, and then seam these pieces together. And then anything that extends past that, I'm going to fold upward and top stitch down as well. And then I can sew the collar over top of it to hide all of those raw edges. And I also just went ahead and clipped this seam for the arm opening and ironed that inward by 1/2 inch as well. So eventually I'll have to use binding or something to cover this, but I haven't decided if I'm fully lining the bodice just yet. And if I end up doing that, then it will get covered during that process. And then this is what the front stomacher portion of the bodice looks like. It's not really a stomacher, it just looks like one because it's not going to be part of the closure of the bodice. It's going to close at the back, but it's made to look like a stomacher, and it's made out of the 2 different fabrics, and then I put some trim around the top edge as well. And this this will need to be lined too, or I'll have to figure out some method of covering up that raw edge later on. So now my front panels are looking like this. I got the collar portion, outer facing brocade part thing, whatever you want to call it, pinned on. So now it covers up all the raw edges from the interior except for the edge around the arm opening, which I haven't figured out how to address just yet. I probably should have finished that before sewing the collar part on, but it's fine, I'll figure it out. But now both edges of these have to be sewn down, and I think I'm going to do that before adding the boning. So I'm going to take a little break, hopefully get that done, and then I'll be back up and back to work. And it's currently about 3:30 p.m. So here's what I'm currently dealing with. I kind of hoped this would be a weekend project, but I didn't get nearly as much work done last night as I'd hoped. So I think it's going to be like at least a 3-day, maybe even a 4-day project due to my own negligence, but it is what it is. So last night I got these front bands sewn on. I think last time I showed you they were pinned on, but now they're stitched on. And I also sewed some twill tape to cover that yucky raw edge around the arm opening, since I'm kind of feeling like I'm not going to end up lining this. So I do want the interior to look somewhat pretty. This is the bad example. Let's ignore that side. This side I did a better job with. Then I top stitched some cotton binding to the back edge of the bodice and folded it inward, and then I just cross stitched one edge down, and then the top edge was stitched down with really tiny slip stitches. And I did add boning into the boning channels at the back of this prior to folding the back edge inward. It did get a little messy at the top because you might not have caught it, but what I did was I sewed the boning channels into this part of the bodice before I sewed up this part, so the channels didn't extend into this top edge. So I kind of just used bones that were long enough to go up into this top portion and then whip stitched the bones where they should be instead of having a channel to encase them. And now I'm hoping that these stitches are small enough that they won't try and poke out at any point. So that was not my brightest move, but I think it's ended up working out just fine. But I do have some extra pins in place just to prevent those bones from shifting when I am cutting the eyelet holes, which will be the next step for this, I think. Actually, the next step is going to be adding the rest of the boning. I added boning to this channel because I was worried I'd accidentally sew this channel shut when sewing on the twill tape. It's more of a concern over here because for some reason it extended farther on this panel. And then I also did the same with the two bones at the side seam, or the side, there isn't a seam there, because I didn't want to sew close this channel either. But I still have bones to add to the front couple of channels, as well as another bone to add here. Then I might end up pressing the pieces because they will be a little bit wobbly after I add the boning. I know a lot of you have told me that you just alternate which direction you put the boning in so the curves smooth themselves out, but that does not work for me. I always end up having to press them. But luckily this fabric is thick enough that I can press it after adding the boning, and it won't create like a shadow impression of the boning on the right side of the fabric, which is something that you can have happen with more delicate materials like silk satin. So after the bones are in and it is pressed, I'm just going to go ahead and poke the holes for the eyelets. As I said, or at least as I think I said, the eyelets are going to be positioned between two steel bones, or actually 3 steel bones. So there's 1 steel bone in the center back edge of the bodice, and then there are 2 bones starting about 3/4 inch away from where that bone encasing ends. So they should be bracketed very nicely and allow this bodice to lace closed without buckling or anything like that. And I've just marked the eyelet placement 3/4 inch away from the back edge and 1 inch apart, so they're all ready to be cut with an awl. And then I will try and find some matching thread to stitch them up. My floor is a disaster, and so is that drawer, so please ignore that. I do have 2 very dreamy drawers of the floss I like using for eyelets. So the colors I want are in this one, and I think one of these browns will end up working just fine. Also, I'm sure you can guess what's over here. Hint, it's the stomacher for this bodice. So I added all of the boning to this last night before sewing the lace trim on, which I'll show you in just a sec. So this morning I ironed it, and then I put a book over top of it and my pattern weights to weigh it down, so after pressing it would sit flat instead of curved like the boning had forced it to be. And you can see a little bit of the boning shadow coming through, but I think I can press that out just fine. So this has a little bit of lace that I fussy cut out and sewed to the top edge, and I think I'm going to make this even more sparkly and wonderful by incorporating some beads and sequins. So I'll have to braid my bead and sequin stash, but that is never a hardship. That is like the highlight of anything I ever end up making. So one of the bodice pieces has been pressed and flattened, but now I'm waiting for the other one to, I was going to say dry, to cool down so it will maintain the shape instead of springing back like the boning wants to. And here you can see the one that's been ironed. Isn't it all flat and lovely? Also, doesn't this fabric look beautiful? I love it so much. I think it's so pretty. But while I've been waiting for that, I pulled out my beading collection. Not all of my beading collection, just the beads that I thought might go well with this project. So I've got some silvery and black ones in here. This is black and silver. This is silver and clear. And then in here, I have either seed beads or sequins. I'm voting sequins. I was wrong. So these are gold and silver ones, but I really only have one bag of silver ones, so we'll see if those are useful. Then here I have sequins, and I felt like at one point I had a lot of sequins, but I mostly just buy sequins for specific projects. I don't have a whole lot of random ones just sitting around that will suit this project, which is really disappointing. I'm so good at buying fabric and beads for no apparent reason, just because I think they're pretty, but I think all sequins are so pretty that I have to show some restraint by only buying them on a project by project basis. But I was actually planning to stock up a little bit on more common colors that I use when I was in the garment district for my birthday, but my birthday is in 9 days and I don't think the garment district is going to be open by then. Also, these two beading boxes are from Michaels, and then these ones are from IKEA, in case you couldn't tell by the kugis on the interior of these lids. Swedish is such a beautiful language. So this is the palette I've created. I wish I had more like small silver sequins and brown sequins, but I just don't. So I've got some black sequins, I've got some clearish gray toned ones, which I think are mostly just going to disappear when I sew them on the fabric, but we'll see. And I've got these like brownish satiny colored ones, so we'll give those a try. These beads are black, but they're faceted, so they have some sheen to them. And these are, I think, the same design, but they're a little bit more clear and they're more of a grayish brown. So those I think are really good candy and go really well with the fabrics for this project. And then I got some true silver ones. I've got these, which I think are too big, but they're kind of similarly sized. Okay, they're much smaller, but there are similarly sized Monties incorporating this lace trim, so I might be able to include some of those as well and really bring out those silver tones. So I will have a play with that, but I think I'm going to try and get the sleeves done first. Usually I don't draft sleeves until I've done a fitting of the bodice because it's much easier to fit the sleeves with the actual bodice you're going to end up wearing. You can really see how it works inside the arm side and how the bodice fits and how that affects the fit of the sleeves. But these sleeves actually have a pinned portion at the top, so they aren't going to be fully set into the arm side, they're just going to be strips that are set into the arm side, which gives me a little bit more flexibility in terms of the actual fit of the sleeve. So if it ends up being slightly too long, then I can just push the sleeve up and these will puff out a little bit more. If it ends up being a bit too short, then those will just have more tension on them. So I think that's fine, and hopefully before I finalize and finish the sleeves, I'll have the bodice finished enough that I can do a fitting. I can't really do a fitting with the bodice until the eyelets are in because I want to wait until the eyelets are in before I figure out what seam allowance I'm going to sew the stomach around with. If it ends up being like an inch too big, then I can actually sew this on with a 1-inch seam allowance instead of the 1/2 inch I'd originally planned. If it ends up being too small, I can sew it on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance instead of the 1/2 inch I originally had planned. That's why I can't just sew this piece on and then baste a zipper into the back of this and try it on that way. I really want to wait until the eyelets are in so I can lace it up and see how it fits in that way. But that means it's going to take a little while before I can do a proper fitting with the bodice because I have 30 eyelets to sew first. Hopefully that'll make sense. But anyway, I'm going to at least start drafting these sleeves today. Even if I can't finalize the exact dimensions of the puffed portion at the top, I could probably fit the rest of it, especially the little cuff portion, which is where I'm thinking the lace trim will go. And this is very heavily inspired by Kernach paintings. If you're not familiar with his work, I will link a page with a whole bunch of his paintings down below. His work isn't totally safe for work. There's a lot of severed heads and a lot of nudity, but when he does paint dresses, they're very, very pretty dresses, and I've taken a lot of inspiration from those. Mine's just much simplified compared to the ones that he shows in paintings, because his oftentimes have dozens of puffs on the sleeves, whereas mine are only going to have 3. Okay, after saying I'm not doing as many puffs as you'd usually see in his paintings, I've decided that I kind of want to follow the sleeves in this painting a little bit more closely and actually do that amount of puffs. So instead of just having a puff at the shoulder and having a puff at the elbow and having a puff at the wrist, I'd actually have a puff at the elbow and then a band and then another puff and then a band. So these are going to be really tiny puffs, and then it would be the same at the shoulder. So there would be a puff, a band, a tiny puff, and then another band. So I'm going to try and draw out a sleeve pattern and figure out how wide each of these bits would be, because it's going to get pretty fiddly if I'm having all of these components over a sleeve that is, 20 inches long. So it might take some finagling and it might take a lot longer to construct than I had originally planned, but that is par for the course with my costumes. I went through and did just a really rough kind of layout of where the puffs would be and where the bands would be, and I think I can do it. I'm gonna have to make the bands I think 3/4 of an inch instead of the 1 inch I'd originally planned, just to give more space between everything, but it should work out just fine. So after doing that, I took some measurements of my arm and I drafted a very simple sleeve pattern, and I'm going to do quite a few fittings with this, I think, to fine-tune it a little bit. I want it to be as fitted as possible. I want to still be able to get it on off over my wrist without having to have any additional closures. So we'll see how that goes, and then once I've finished the fit of the fitted portion, I will work on the cuff that extends over the hand. So this is sleeve pattern number 1 that I showed you, which I just drafted super quickly based on my arm measurements. And I found with this that it was too tight in some areas, too big in other areas, and it needed more space at the top edge. So then we moved on to this. One major change was taking an inch out of this portion to make it rise higher on the arm, which really changed the fit overall. I also added darts to the portion where the elbow was to create more of a curved effect. And then I tapered it in towards the wrist. Then over here we have the final pattern, or kind of the final pattern. I ended up adding a seam at the elbow just to get a more perfected fit there. I lengthened the panels a little bit more, and I also drafted the cuff. So now I'm really happy with this, so I just have to go ahead and split this piece up into all the various different sleeve components. I did do this earlier, which kind of roughly gave me the measurements for each portion of the sleeve, but now it's going to be a little bit more involved actually getting that sorted out. So it is now the next day. I actually just finished the eyelets on the bodice, so I can start fitting that if I want, but I've primarily been focusing on the sleeves today. So the sleeves are made up of a whole bunch of different components. I've actually finished, or mostly finished, the bottom portion of the sleeves, but this is the top portion of the sleeve. And I was originally going to break these up into a whole bunch of separate pattern pieces, but instead I've actually just been cutting the pieces to fit over top of this that you see in front of me. So it's been probably a little less precise, but also a lot easier because I'm not working with so many different pattern pieces at once. But basically the sleeves are made up of a few different things. They're made up of straight 3/4 inch wide brocade bands, which I already have cut out. They're made up of 1 inch wide pane portions, then more brocade bands, then there is a solid sleeve portion, more brocade bands, 1 inch pane portion, more brocade bands, and then there are the larger pane portions, which are 1 inch wide strips that are trimmed with lace. So over here I have one of the soon to be 1 inch wide paint portions. Sorry about all the wind going on, I have my window open. And these pieces are going to be 1 inch wide on the finished sleeve because they will poof up when the sleeve is fitted to the arm, but they're actually cut to be 3 inches long. So over here I have a whole bunch of those pieces that are cut to length that need to be sewn together and then sewn onto ribbon to hold them in place temporarily before seaming them to the brocade bands. Then over here I have a strip that hasn't been cut into 3 inch lengths just yet. So this is what was a 2.5 inch wide strip of material that was sewn to a tube with 1/2 inch wide seam allowances and then turned right side out. And then over here I have what was a 3 inch wide strip that was then sewn to a tube with 1/2 inch wide seam allowances and then turned right side out, forming a 1 inch wide tube. So that was pressed, so the seam allowance was on the back side of the tube, and then I just machine stitched some lace trim onto each side. I usually try and avoid machine stitching, but it really isn't visible given the sheen of this fabric, and it was much faster to do it that way, given that I had to sew trim onto both edges of 4 60-inch long strips, so it would have taken quite a while to do by hand. I have a couple more of those strips over there, which will eventually be cut into all of the lengths you see marked here to form the top paint portion, and then this strip is going to get cut into 3 inch wide lengths, and then those are going to be sewn together and sewn onto ribbon, and then I will start piecing everything together. So I just cut out all of the wider strips to be the right length to form the paint portion at the shoulder. So these will be sewn together soon, but I'm focusing on the final 3 inch wide paint portion to insert in the sleeve. So my strip was cut into 3 inch pieces, and I just chain stitched them together with the right side facing outward. Now I'm going to put this ribbon kind of just over top of the ends by about 1/4 inch and top stitch it on, making sure that all of the strips are as close together as possible without overlapping. And I'm going to sew them on between this point and this point. Those mark how long the strip needs to be, and this is the center point of the strip. And then if I end up using, say, 17 strips for this one, I'm going to make sure that there are 17 strips on the other one too. So that way it will be symmetrical. So this is what everything looks like now. I ended up getting the ribbon securing all of those little bands together, and then I also secured the larger bands together. So now the next step is just going to be cutting the brocade to size to fit between them. So this piece here is this piece here is this piece, and then it's going to be bracketed by 2 pieces of brocade. So not including the brocade bands, this is what it's going to look like, and then there will be bands in between each of these pieces. And this is just the upper half of the sleeve. So there is a lower half of the sleeve that will need to be sewn on as well. I just have it downstairs because I've gotten to the stage where it's completely assembled. I just have to add the lining. And in this case, the lining is just strips of the linen tape I have over there to cover up all the raw edges of the brocade underneath the 3/4 inch wide bands. So it doesn't have a proper full sleeve lining because obviously these parts have to be left open. So I'm just lining inside the brocade bands where all of those seams and the raw edges are. I'm not sure how I'm going to bind the side seam allowance just yet, but I will figure that out when that point comes. Alright, so I got all of the brocade strips cut, and this time instead of cutting them individually, I cut all of the strips for one side, and I just used those cut strips to cut out the strips for the other side. So that's one sleeve, that's another sleeve. The next step is just going to be trimming the ribbon down so it is level with the ends of the pained portions. Otherwise, I will be including the length of the ribbon and the seam allowance, and they will end up coming out too long. And I also have to mark the centers of each pained portion so I can align that with the notches I've already clipped into the various pieces of fabric. So this is how it looks all sewn together, minus the bottom panel. Also, this doesn't look that different of color in person. This fabric does fade slightly towards the selvages, but in person with the sheen, you really don't notice that that's more brown than it is black. But on camera, it's showing up strikingly different. Anyway, this is how it looks with all of the bands and pained portions sewn together, except for the bottom portion being sewn to the top portion. I'm going to wait until all of these seams are finished prior to doing that. And the way I'm going to finish the seams is, as I said earlier, with this linen tape. So I'm basically just going to trim the frayed edges in between the pieces down. And then the linen tape is going to be slip stitched over top of those raw edges. So it will neatly finish off the raw edges and prevent them from fraying, but it's not going to add a lot of additional bulk. It's not going to extend into the pained portions like a traditional lining would and potentially choke through. So that is going to be the next step. I was going to get this pinned up here and show you how it looked up here before going downstairs and then show you what it looks like finished as well. But my dog is getting really anxious because it's kind of stormy out. So I think I'm going to head downstairs and do that while watching some TV, and then I'll show you what it looks like later. So these are what the sleeves are looking like so far, and I realize they look huge. They look so long, but you have to consider that this is actually going to puff up to only be 1 inch on the arm. Same for this. This is going to puff up to half its current width. The same for this piece, and this piece. So it will end up fitting much shorter on the arm, or at least that is the plan. Also, some of these pieces were sewn upside down, so the sheen of them is different, but it really isn't that noticeable when it's actually worn. I did tests with it, and after I realized this was happening, I was much more careful in positioning them. But that's why some have a stronger sheen than others. But as I said, once they're puffed up and on the arm, it really isn't that noticeable because you're seeing them all from the same angle. But it is what it is. At least the larger stripes are all in order, so they have the full sheen factor. But anyway, last night I went ahead and I got the lining in for all of these. This is the only seam I have left to sew. Then I will have to line that seam as well. I also got the skirt seam together last night. So it's made up of a few different bands. This whole project has kind of been inspired by Crenanche paintings, and he has a couple where you see the skirts, and they have alternating bands that mimic the different materials used on the bodice. So I have a large band of brocade at the bottom or at the hem. Then I have a band of this shiny file fabric, a smaller band of that brocade, another band of that file fabric, and then even smaller band of the brocade. And then the direction of the file fabric changes, so it is shinier. It seemed weird to have the shiny fabric going vertically striped here, but I did want the upper portion to be vertically striped just because I think it looks nicer in that form. So it's kind of a mishmash, but I think it will end up working in the end. And I am going to cartridge pleat this fabric, which means the top edge will have to be bulked out with flannel or some sort of thicker material to give it enough oomph to have really pretty looking cartridge pleats. But I'm also thinking about adding something to the hem to give it a little bit more oomph, because in those paintings you also see really defined kind of rippled hems. So I'm thinking maybe I'll try starching this, and then maybe I'll even consider lining it. Ideally I would line it with something like buckram, but I don't have enough of that, or even like a fusible interfacing, but I don't have very much of that either. So I'm thinking about either sewing like 6-inch wide horsehair together to get a piece wide enough to create that effect, or using some of that canvas that I was using to line the bodice. That fabric's like $8 a yard, so I don't really want to use potentially 4 yards of it in the skirt, but maybe if I cut it into narrower strips, I could get away with using less of it. I don't know. I'm gonna have a little play around and hopefully I'll come up with something I'm happy with that gives this skirt more volume. But before doing any of that, I'm actually going to give this a really thorough ironing. Some of the edges of the pieces kind of warped a little bit or something. So you see a few little puckers like here, and there are also a few points where it isn't perfectly straight like up here. So I'm hoping that just by doing a really thorough ironing of this, it'll look a little bit sharper and a little bit cleaner than it does right now. But to do that, I have to refill my iron and I really don't feel like it. So I think I'm going to start the day off by working on sleeves. Actually, now I remember what I wanted to work on this morning, and it wasn't the skirt. And it was the sleeves, but it was also a different part of the sleeves. Over here I have the pieces I cut out for the cuffs of the sleeves. And as I said earlier, I want to add some appliques to the hem of these and just make them look really elaborate and detailed, much like the stomacher on the bodice. And I actually have all the eyelets sewn on the bodice, so I could pin the stomacher in and do a fitting of that this morning as well. But mainly what I wanted to do is iron the seams of these pieces and then sew them together. So this is going to be the lining for each cuff piece, and then this is going to be the outer material. And then I'm going to trim the outer edge with some of that lace that I've been using to trim like the cuffs and the bodice and whatnot. Then I can go downstairs and start fussy cutting out some of those lace appliques that I used on the stomacher, and positioning those around the hem of these pieces, and also using some of the beads and sequins that I pulled out earlier. And then whatever beads I end up using on the cuff, I'll be mimicking on the stomacher to kind of tie everything together. I'm also considering incorporating some of that silver lace into the skirt, maybe having it bordering the middle band. I don't really want to use so much of it that I have it running around the edges of each band, but I'm also not super opposed to that because I originally purchased this trim for the project that I was going to make this fabric into. Now that I'm using this fabric for something else, it does kind of make sense to use the trim for something else too. It just feels kind of wasteful. So I'm still undecided about that, but I would like to incorporate the trim into the skirt somehow, just so it doesn't end up feeling disjointed. The appeal of working on the cuffs this morning and doing the bodice fitting is that then I can move on to doing all of the beading and really start to see these coming together and get fully assembled. And that's also something that I can do in front of the TV, which is appealing since I have like 12 episodes of Gold Rush on the DVR. I feel like it's probably a surprise to no one that I watch reality TV, but you probably wouldn't expect it to be Gold Rush and Naked and Afraid and River Monsters. Oh man, do I ever miss River Monsters. However, I don't have a backlog of Naked and Afraid, so it's really just going to be Gold Rush today. I definitely don't enjoy that show just because I have a crush on Parker. There are other reasons. So I just pinned the front section in, and then I pinned the bottom edge up by 1/2 inch. How many pins do you think I will bend and potentially break in this process? Who knows? There's going to be quite a lot of strain on these pins since I will be lacing it closed, and hopefully we're getting some sort of reduction in the waist. I measured the bottom edge, and I think it's at 29 inches. So once pulled taut, it will probably be at 30 inches. And typically for bodices, I like the waist to be about 28 inches. So I'm probably going to be able to take it in a little bit at the waist here, but I definitely want to do a fitting first and see. Also, I have to account for the fact that the cartridge pleats tend to add a bit of bulk. They shouldn't, but I find that they end up adding just a little bit of bulk, so I do want to leave like 1/2 inch or an inch or about that of wiggle room, just in case the skirt does make it fit a little bit tighter. Oh, and the reason I'm doing this is to see how far my beading should extend, because if I end up taking this in by 1 inch, then that's 1 inch of beading that I don't have to add here. So that's just why I'm doing this before I'm adding all of the beading and everything. So this is what I'm currently working with. I've just prepped a bunch of work to do downstairs for my Gold Rush marathon. Not sponsored, I promise, but I got the elbow portion or the bottom portion of the sleeve seamed to the top portion, and then I covered the raw edge with some linen tape that can now be whip stitched on. After doing all this, I did a fitting, and they fit my arms widthwise, but lengthwise I'm having some issues. So this part is supposed to sit flat against the arm, and so is this part, and then these parts are supposed to poof up. But since these are made out of more layers of fabric, they're thicker, and they actually have more structural integrity than the parts that are supposed to sit flat against the arm. So I'm going to have to add some sort of lining. Ideally, if I could go back in time, I would have interfaced them. It's too late for that now, so I'm going to have to add some sort of backing material for them to make them much stiffer, so they're more inclined to sit flat against the arm, and then these portions will puff up as they should. Now, my options for this is the canvas that I used for the stomacher portion of the bodice. So this is a medium weight canvas interlining, but I'm not sure if that's even going to be thick enough. So another thing I could use is something that you add to collars and cuffs to make them really stiff. It's not even used in traditional suiting because it's so heavyweight. It's used for like decorative costume elements. So I could potentially use that, but it's quite scratchy and I'm worried that it might almost be too stiff. So once I have this sewn on, I think I'm going to cut out the canvas interlining for one sleeve and cut out that stiffer canvas for costume stuff for the other sleeve and see which I like better. And then I will cut out whichever one ends up working for the other sleeve and get it all sewn in as well. And my plan for attaching it is to cut a piece the same size as this piece and then just use some really thin twill tape to finish the edges and then just whip stitch it to the linen tape that's already sewn between the pieces. And then over here I have the stomacher panel. I also have the cuffs. Basically I just sewed the two layers together with the right sides facing each other and then I turned it so the right sides were facing outward. I also top stitched the cuffs together at the top edge and then I just quickly bound that with some of that linen tape. And then at the bottom edge I top stitched some of that metallic lace trim around the edge. And now I'm going to sew the remaining edge of the lace trim to the lining by hand because it is flipping out a little bit. And then I'm also going to add some of these lace appliques to the edge of it. These appliques come from a lace fabric that I have some of over here, so I'm just going to be fussy cutting these out and then cutting them to smaller pieces so they will suit the edge. And then these are the beads I picked out earlier that I thought I could incorporate into this design as well, so I can definitely add some of those to embellish it further. And last time we talked, I was also thinking about doing a fitting for the bodice. It went really well. It fits really nicely over the shoulders. It's a little small in the bust, so I actually ended up taking a 1/4 inch off the bottom of this so I can move the panel down and hopefully get a bit more, quite literally, breathing room in the chest. And then it was a little bit large in the waist, which I also kind of suspected, so I decided to take the waist in by 1 inch, and that means that I'm taking an extra 1/2 inch here and extra 1/2 inch here when seaming it to the bodice. So just to keep in mind where I would be securing it to the other piece of the bodice, I used chalk to mark that line, and then I used machine basting stitches to mark that line as well, and then I just machine basted across the bottom edge to prevent the boning from slipping out. So that's what it looks like on the inside. You can see the basting stitches a lot more clearly. And now I can bedazzle this a little bit, and then I can get back to work on the skirt and sorting out the sleeves and everything like that. But so far this project is going really well, like disturbingly well, and I really hope it stays this way. And I'm cutting the footage off here. I'm sorry if this seems kind of like an abrupt ending. I filmed way more than I thought I did. So when I was reviewing and editing the footage, I realized that I had over an hour of vlog footage after it had been roughly edited down. So I had to split it in half, and there was no natural breaking point, so I've just decided that this is where that break is going to be. But I'm not going to leave you on a cliffhanger. I am going to include some photos of how the dress looks finished on my dress form. Hopefully seeing it complete in all of its glory will motivate you to subscribe and come back for the second video about making this project, where I get it finished off and also make a coordinating hat and hairnet. I haven't filmed the wrap-up for part 2 just yet, but hopefully it will also include some more photos of the finished project. So definitely subscribe and stay tuned for that. But before you go, I just want to give a shout out and thank you to all of my wonderful, very patient patrons. I'm super behind on credits, so these are actually from February. I'm gonna have a whole bunch of my patrons' names on screen, but I also want to give a verbal shout out to my top tier patrons, who are Jordan Carpenter, Sharon Cyrus, Mo Quintana, Courtney F., Tracy Smith, Dot Cosplay, Sharon Wigham, Victoria Rose, and Alex Perez. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you so much to everyone's support. It allows me to keep making costumes like this one and keep making videos like this one as well. I realize my content has been coming out at a slower pace recently, and I really do appreciate all of your patience with me. I'm trying to focus a little bit more on quality over quantity, but I do feel like I need to up my quantity a little bit too, so hopefully I'll become better at balancing those things. But enough of that. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a comment and like. It really helps me out, and if you want to see me finish off this dress, then definitely subscribe, because part 2 is coming very, very soon. And thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it, and I'll talk to all of you very soon.